Hello, everybody. Peter Marivelis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. I'd like to welcome you all to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the fall season. Tonight, inaugurating the fall season, we are thrilled to have back in the house Achy Obejas, celebrating the launch of a new bilingual poetry edition titled Boomerang. It is published by our friends over at Beacon Press as part of the Raised Voices series. Raised Voices was established in 2021 to publish works that affirm progressive values, raise marginalized voices and perspectives, and make them accessible to a wider readership. Achy is a writer, translator, and activist. She has received numerous honors for her work. She is a two-time Lambda Literary Award winner and recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Poetry and the USA Artist Fellowship. She has also received a Pulitzer Prize and Studs Terkel Journalism Prize for her journalism. She worked as a journalist in Chicago for over 2 decades. Achy is the author of the short fiction collection, The Tower of Antilles, which was nominated for a PEN/Faulkner Award. She is also the author of the novels Memory Mambo, Ruins, and Days of Awe, which was a Los Angeles Times Best Books of the Year title. She is also the author of the poetry chapbook, This Is What Happened in Our Other Life. Her stories and poems have appeared in Prairie Schooner, Fifth Wednesday Journal, TriQuarterly, another Chicago magazine, as well as many other publications. As a translator, she has worked with Wendy Guerra, Rita Indiana, Juno Diaz, and Megan Maxwell, amongst others. She is currently a writer and editor for Netflix. A native of Havana, she currently resides in the San Francisco Bay Area. And joining her tonight in conversation is Daniel Borzutzky. He is a poet and translator who lives in Chicago. His most recent book is Written After a Massacre in the year 2018, recently published by Coffee House Press. His 2016 collection, The Performance of Becoming Human, won the National Book Award. His poetry collection, Lake Michigan, was a finalist for the Griffin International Poetry Prize. His other books include In the Murmurs of the Rotten Carcass Economy, also Memories of My Overdevelopment, and the Book of Interfering Bodies. His translation of Galo Ghigliotto's Valdivia won the National Translation Award, and he has also translated collections by Raúl Zurita and Jaime Luis Huenún. Please join us now in giving a warm welcome in celebration of this really wonderful collection. Achy Obejas, Daniel Borzutzky, welcome to you both. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Wow, this is neat. This is kind of exciting. I'm very happy to be here with Daniel.
I am so happy to be. I am so happy to be celebrating Achy's new book, and I think Achy, you're going to start by reading. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to read actually one of the longer pieces, if you don't mind. Okay, this is Volver. You're returning. You're going back to where it all began. Careful to engage in the necessary oblivion of the circumstances that took you away in the first place. You will hold your breath and pretend enough answers have been provided to satisfy your pride, your urge to be here, on the threshold of what might have been home if not for upheaval, if not for the price of sugar and oil on the world market, if not for the assurance of safety and comfort elsewhere, if not for revolution and exile. Y aunque no quise regreso, siempre se vuelve. Here is the sea, the jeweled sea, flickering with caution. The sea soaking you, stopping you in your tracks, impeding your salt-encrusted progress. And here too is the sea, its waves knocking you off balance, so you must reconsider what you know of the view. An arresting vista, the promise of atonement in your return. Someone is saying, put your mouth on mine, and let us create a pleura to sustain us. Put your mouth on mine, and walk carefully this way, side to side to the water's edge, tilting our heads together to see the inner tube, the vacant skiff, the remains of a flying machine. Put your mouth on mine, breathe, and don't worry about the aftertaste. Es un soplo, la vida. Oh yes, you have returned and you want to drop to your knees and kiss the ground, embrace the columns in the old city, the neighbor who remembers you when you were a newborn and not yet in exile, not yet marked for departure by air or water, or accompanied legal, solo, legal or illegal. Behind you, you hear someone saying, you, returnee, what did you bring me? But no, don't turn your head, stay here, disseminating emotions in our shared spit. Put your mouth on mine, put your mouth on mine. Your step is halting, you're obeying this ritual, a convention with which you're utterly unfamiliar, and you have surrendered to this breathing down each other's throats like a native. Later, you will confuse the beginning and end of the journey, the packing and the unpacking and repacking of your bags. You will forget what you brought to give away and what you brought to put back in its proper place. Le olvido que todo destruye. You will be confused about what to take, what to accept, what to leave behind. You will weep while walking on the boulevards, and you will notice that as you pass, the students on the seawall are also weeping, as are the young mothers and the pickpockets, the new entrepreneurs and the masturbators. Someone will say, put your mouth on mine. And someone else will say, we're all weeping because you weren't here. We're wrecked because you weren't here. How can we have talked about progress without your input? How can we have contemplated the beauty of the sea without your voice in the national discourse? We are weeping because there's a hole in the nation where you should have been, a deep and painful hole, a black hole with your name on it. Now put your mouth on mine and let's tilt our heads towards the abyss and be careful not to fall. Put your mouth on mine and don't worry about the aftertaste. It's nothing. It's the taste of nothing, the wind, a goose egg, a knot on the quipu. Put your mouth on mine and let the wind become a voice that tells the story in which the goose egg is you. Tengo miedo del encuentro, tengo miedo de las noches que pobladas de recuerdos encadenan mi soñar. Tengo miedo de decirte que te quiero y no quererte. You ever feel like nobody ever understands you but you? Cultivo. Cultivo una rosa blanca. Cultivo una rosa blanca en junio como en enero. The sea, the blue sea beneath the battleships, the freighters, the cruise ships, the blue sea beneath us, beneath the empty inner tube, the vacant skiff, the remnants of the flying machine. It's a short distance, a meager expanse. Put your mouth on mine. Put your mouth on mine. Ike, Ike. You have returned to shake hands with everyone, with sworn enemies and innocents, con la amiga sincera, con la cruel que me arranca, with the carefully selected audience that has been prepared for your performance. You shake hands with reluctance, and others you shake hands eagerly, but you shake and shake until someone hands you a script and then you stop and stare. Oh, you recognize this. A lullaby, a presidential address perhaps, but goddammit, how do you read that accent? How do you bring all the eloquence of your heart to the moment when your tongue stumbles and falls like a tourist who's gone too far out in a tamarind? Cultivo una rosa blanca, carajo. You set out to write your autobiography, which will be a collective biography of all the people you were exiled with. You want to be understood, you want to be precise, so you leave out metaphors, you leave out anything that could be symbolically confusing. You leave out the politics, you leave out the part about exile and your mouth on mine. Using a long goose feather quill, you write, I have come back to extend my hand in kinship. You write, sometimes the most important changes happen in small places. You write, the tides of history can leave people in conflict and exile and poverty. You write, it takes times for those circumstances to change. You write, the recognition of a common humanity, the reconciliation of a people bound by blood and a belief in one another. You tilt your head towards the water's edge, the black hole. Put your mouth on mine. It's an order, man. Do you not understand? Exile is actuality, animation. Exile is endurance and presence, the rat race, the real world. It's the journey and the entity you sleep with every night, the subject of every memo, every recipe, every instruction manual, every warranty and contract. Exile is everything, everything possible within the possibility of return. Finally, you go to that one boathouse, the one you've never seen. You read all about it in the guidebook on the bus on the way there, how it's surrounded by palm trees growing out of the water, how it's guarded by angry geese that bark when you're near it. When you get there, colors are beautiful, long splashes of orange in the sky, a circuit of white orchids ringing their bells. You want so much to feel, to gasp with wonder, to identify. You want the geese to bark, to bite your ankles and maybe draw a little blood, but they're tired, curled like kittens on the water's edge. You want desperately for someone to approach you and ask you to put your mouth on their mouth and breathe some kind of warmth, but it's lonely here, lonely and soon very dark. You break into the boathouse, which is dilapidated and slippery with moss. You let yourself fall into the moss, make a bedding from it, smoke some. You entertain yourself making nautical knots you learned abroad, the alpine butterfly loop, the trucker's hitch, the Zeppelin bend. The wind is blowing through the boathouse and it makes a lovely music. When you wake up the next morning, you need a moment to remember where you are. You decide not to eat your provisions, not to open your thermos. You will, instead, live today like those who never went into exile. When you peel away the moss and lift up the floorboards, you get at the water. You realize the boathouse has been unmoored. You lean over the edge and swatting away the geese, you drink from the sea. You drink and drink the salt water until your belly bloats. In julio, como en enero, this is a pain you can live with.
Applause. Thank you. Thank you, Achy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Okay, great. So that is an amazing way to start off our evening. So everyone, we're gonna converse between us, but please feel free to put questions into the chat and we will we'll take them as we go. So we'll talk a little bit, hopefully Achy will read a little bit more as well. So that piece, there's so many like questions just contained alone in that poem, which was titled Volved. The collection is titled Boomerang, right? The first poem in the collection is Boomerang after Aimé Césaire, who I imagine you're thinking about his notebooks of a return to a native land, given that there's so much idea and imagery behind returning. And yet, like, I was thinking about the boomerang, which is something that sort of comes back to you too. But throughout, you know, throughout the book, there is this rhetoric of return, this poetry of return. And I was thinking a lot about it because it doesn't seem to me like it's a kind of nostalgia, and it doesn't seem to me like it is. But it does seem to me like like there is a kind of desire contained with it. So I wonder, maybe just as a starting point, if you can kind of like, you know, talk about what you think the book is sort of returning to, or what the poems are sort of thinking about returning to.
Such a good question, especially because you noted the lack of nostalgia. I'm so happy about that. You know, I'm originally from Havana, and I came here as a kid. My parents, you know, we escaped by boat when I was 6, and growing up, Cuba was this magical place and this terrible place. And it was the place where things had been sort of fantastic and very Shangri-La like until the certain point when then everything became terrible. But every now and then the memories of the good stuff would sort of creep through, and you know, they would forget that they were in exile, and you know, and it would always sort of, my parents' memories and sort of constant tethering to Cuba always seemed to underscore that we were here on sort of a temporary basis, and that we weren't meant to be here forever, and we didn't really belong here. So there was always this idea of this place, you know, this place where we would belong. And as an adult, I did go back, and I found I didn't belong, but yet I did. It was interesting. It was, for me, it was kind of wild to be someplace where everybody talked like this, and you know, moved their hands in the same way as my family, and you know, everybody dropped their consonants, and you know, the humor was the same and all that. And at the same time, the life was very different for those who lived there. I didn't just visit. I stayed for very long periods of time. In 1999, I was there for 9 months straight, and then I spent 4 days in Port-au-Prince and turned around and went back for another 3 months. So I was living very much like a Cuban, and I was living with a Cuban, but at the same time, very aware of my privilege, very, 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 very conscious of the fact that I could move in ways that other people could not, and that my access to things and to people and to power were very significant compared to other people. So I had returned and I was comfortable, but it was also very uncomfortable to understand all those things and to understand that I couldn't go back. But also going back, I explored a lot the notion of how those of us who had left were thought of, you know, because having left as a child, I was forgiven the sin of leaving. If you're a kid, the Cuban, when you leave, the Cuban government actually absolves you of all the potential criminal possibilities of having left illegally, as we did, because we stole a boat, we left in the middle of the night. But I was absolved of all of that, and so it was a very peculiar position to be in. And because I'm a writer, and because they were very sort of interested in moving me to see their point of view, the cultural sort of machine was very active in trying to find a place for me, trying to make me comfortable and make me feel at home. So it was, there's a lot going on when I went back.
Since you kind of broached this at the end there, but I've often thought about this with your novels, especially Ruins, which is so much about it, which takes place in Cuba, is entirely a book of Cuba, and as you were talking about the Cuban cultural agencies bringing you in, I mean, did they think of you? I guess, do they think of you as a Cuban writer? Do you? I guess I have a follow-up to that.
That's
question.
so funny that you say that. Yeah, when it's convenient, I'm very much a Cuban writer. I had a book published in Cuba, and everybody made a big deal out of the fact that the imprint that it was published under was for native writers, for people who live in Cuba. And you know, at one point there was a big movement that I wasn't aware of until kind of last minute to make me a member of the Cuban Writers Union. Of course, I backed away from that because I had besides being politically very fraught, it had the premise of causing my mother to have a heart attack and perhaps die. So that might not be a good idea. But yeah, no, I mean, there was, I think there was some sincere, attention, and I think there was some politically motivated attention. I mean, as happens in, I think, a lot of places like Cuba. I mean, I think, I spent so much time there. I had an 8-year relationship with somebody, and we went back and forth all the time. So and she was pretty well known, and so we were, we were sort of darlings, and we were sort of symbolically interesting because she was there, I was here, and here was this romantic reconciliation. I remember when we broke up, we wound up both of us invited to this luncheon, and the Minister of Culture was blabbing away, And at some point he said, yeah, you guys are just like US-Cuba relations. If you guys could just get back together, we could just solve everything. And it really kind of hit home about the propagandistic possibilities of our relationship. Well,
that is kind of predicting one of my next questions, which is about the same poem where you have this line that you read. You set out to write your autobiography, which will be a collective biography of all the people who were exiled with you. And then later in the poem, or maybe earlier in the poem, you talk about how there is the nation is, the individual is not grieving the nation, rather the nation is grieving the individual, which is an interesting reversal of what normally happens. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that line about kind of the individual in the collective, which in Cuba, of course, is a very fraught and difficult subject, but where you're coming at that from.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything in Cuba is collective, either inherently or by force.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, Cubans are horrifically individualistic, and it creates a real tension and a real drama. There's a lot of positioning and this idea that there's never enough to go around, whether it's material, whether it's material goods or whether it's ideological space or cultural space. There's always a sense that you're fighting for turf. But those of us in diaspora, again, are haloed. We operate sort of above and beyond. My girlfriend at the time, who, as I mentioned, was also very well known and an artist of much renown, she met the nomenclature because of me. I met them before she did, because as a diasporic person, I had access to the upper echelons, before she did. I introduced her to the Ministry of Culture, which was crazy. And it always struck me as very interesting how we are always individuals from the outside, but they are always embedded in this collectivity, whether they like it or not. And I think they frequently do that thing of putting it out like we're the missing piece, or we're a missing piece, or we're led to think that anyway.
I'm just reading a comment from the audience who somebody who says that they did get to know your work in Cuba and that they do indeed identify you as a Cuban writer. So that is a different answer. All right, so we'll go back to the poems. But in this case, also to go back to get into, well, two things. One related to translation, but one sort of related to both the English and the translations. But I want to talk about your author's note, where you tell us that you are trying to create a gender-free language, a poetry that is as gender-free as possible, which you say in English is easier to accomplish in Spanish. And then you conclude by saying that sometimes a gender-free text is not only impossible, but not useful. But since people are encountering your book for the first time, I feel like it's important for you to talk about that. So could you just talk about the process of how you, especially in Spanish, how you sought to create a genderless text?
Yeah, I mean, the idea initially was just to try to approach this in a way that did something different with gender. I'd in Chicago, I'd not really encountered the discussion, the conversation about gender as much as I had here in California. So for me, when I moved here in 2013, it was really interesting. I mean, I remember in my classrooms, everybody had to give their gender pronouns at the very beginning of class, and it was like, what the hell, and what I found very interesting was that in English, it had sort of fallen into this business of they, when I thought that actually there were better options. Marge Piercy had proposed per in an earlier book, and in The Cook and the Carpenter, Jim Jordan had used na, which I really love. I really like the sound of it too, but like nobody responded to those. Everybody was into they. And then the question of what to do with it in Spanish, and the X was alive and well, and still is alive and well for a lot of people. But I always had a problem with the X because it's unpronounceable in Spanish. So it seemed like if you're going to create something that's neutral in Spanish, it has to work in Spanish. And if it doesn't work in Spanish, it's kind of meaningless. And then I heard about people using the E to replace the A and the O in Spanish, but there are really no rules around it. And the way that it had been approached so far was that it was only used with people. And it was only used with people regardless of their gender identification. The idea was just to obliterate gender across the board. But the table remained feminine, and the clitoris remained masculine for reasons that completely escape me. And, other words were just, I just don't understand why inanimate objects are gendered. And so I just chose to get rid of all of it. But as I was trying to do that, I realized I ended up rewriting a lot of things, because I realized, for example, that I can't think of my mother as ungendered. My mother is very much a woman of her time and of her culture and of her place in history, for good and bad. And I, when I wrote this piece about Ana Mendieta, and I degendered it, and then I realized, well, that's not fair, because Ana was killed because she's a woman. And gendered mattered very much in her life. And I have a piece about Hemingway, or in which Hemingway plays a role, and it's very hard to degender Hemingway, who was, very robustly masculine, in ways good and bad. So it was an interesting experiment, because some of the poems do both. They degender, but they also, in some cases, leave the gender intact. Like the Ana Mendieta poem degenders everything but her. I think this is something for which there's no real solution right now. I think this is something that Spanish speakers have to think about and contemplate, and over time develop something new. I mean, the thing about language is that language is always evolving. It's a completely different ballgame. So, from any moment to another historical moment. So this isn't like the notion that language will change is not radical. How it might change is radical, or could be radical, but language changes, and it changes all the time.
I wondered too, then, if you can talk about your translation of this work. It's interesting that over the last few years, there have been some excellent and notable poets of Caribbean origins who are involved in self-translation. So you, what are you on? Noel, Raquel Salas Rivera, both of whom have Puerto Rican roots. But but there's something very particular, I think, about their approaches to self-translation, and I think there's something particular about yours. But I wonder if you can kind of talk about, like, are you writing in English first, in Spanish first? What is going on when you are translating? Like, what's the process look like?
Well, I write in both. I tend to write more in English than Spanish. I am in whatever language is spoken. I sort of like, when in Rome, do as the Romans, you know, like when I spend long periods of time in Mexico or long periods of time in Cuba, you know, the channel switches and I'm just in Spanish. And, you know, leave me in Cuba for 2 months and I have to go, ¿cómo se dice blah? Because I forget really simple things in English. But in this particular case, some of the poems I wrote in Spanish first, some of the poems I wrote in English first, but in nearly all cases, I also brought in people to help me. If I was going into Spanish, I brought in people like Mabel Cuesta and Jimena Codina and Amanda Fleites, and Eduardo Paricio actually did the first translation of Volver. He did it for the website Bridges to Cuba that first published it, Richard Blanco and Ruth Behar's thing. So, and I went over to play with it and then eventually degender it. But I like bringing in other ideas, and I like, I am constantly texting Mabel and asking her all kinds of bullshit. You know, hey, Mabel, ¿cómo se dice? ¿Cómo tú dirías? ¿Qué tú crees de esta frase? And you know, it's a lovely back and forth, and she does that with me with English. Even though I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I mean, I was born in Havana and I grew up till 6 speaking only Spanish. I don't have any formal education in Spanish. So I feel very much that I need to occasionally check in. Also, the regional differences in Spanish can sometimes be quite daunting. And while those of us who usually write in English for an American audience don't think about that very often, I don't think most of us worry about how this is going to sound to somebody in, you know, South Africa or Australia. I do think that those of us who grew up in the United States and we grew up in multi-Latino communities, and when we are writing in the US in Spanish, we frequently contemplate what it sounds like to other people. You know, I mean, I have certain words that I refuse to give up on, like la guagua es la guagua. You know, this is my favorite word. I cannot get rid of that word. It will always be la guagua and people will just have to deal with it. But there are things that I want people to understand, and I know that if I stick to a very, very Cuban argot, it's not going to happen. You know, it's not just Americans who are going to miss it. It's going to be, you know, my Peruvian friends. So it's something I love to think about, to contemplate. Where do I land here in all these, you know, different Spanishes? You know, I sound Cuban when I talk. I don't have an accent when I talk in Spanish, but I very much have Cuban cadence. And most of my slang, my vernacular is Cuban, but I also have all kinds of weird things that crawl up every now and then. I say vale a lot, and Cubans don't say vale. You know, I say vaina, and Cubans don't say vaina. You know, they're just things that have like stuck to me over time. And I've kept them. So I mean, when I do translation for other people, the rules are very different, because I have to think about who they are and what they're doing and the audience that they're trying to reach. You know, when I'm translating Junot Diaz, I'm very much in the Caribbean, and I need to stay there, and I need to sound Black, and I need to sound, you know, authentic to New Jersey in Spanish. But when I'm translating, say Megan Maxwell, I just need to sound randy and raunchy, in a kind of universal way. So it depends, I mean, you translate, you know what I'm talking about, how you have to adjust your voice to the voice of the author that you're translating.
Are you, and maybe one more translation related question, then maybe you could read something else, if that's okay.
Sure.
But are you concerned about being faithful to yourself?
What a good question, Daniel. God, I never really thought about it in quite that way, but I think I'm concerned with the language being interesting and the language being rhythmic and sonorous. I'm very interested in how it sounds. I read my stuff aloud a lot, especially poetry, but I also read my prose aloud. I mean, every novel I've ever published, I've read aloud probably 2 or 3 times just to get the right sound. My voice is different in Spanish. When I initially write in Spanish, it is different than my voice in English. My voice in Spanish is in some ways looser, but also my sentences tend to be shorter, which is curious because Spanish usually works the other way around. And I mean, Spanish is usually about 18 to 20 some percent longer than English. And I'm a little bit more emotionally distant in Spanish sometimes than I am in English, which again, I think sort of goes against the stereotype of what Spanish is. But Spanish is a more deliberate and conscious affair for me because I spend most of my life in English. I have 2 kids that speak primarily in English. My friends are mostly English speaking, and when they're Spanish speaking, there's a lot of code switching. So English seems to be what my access is, in spite of Spanish being my first language.
So if you would read something else, that would be great, and then maybe we can start. People in the audience could jump in with questions.
I'm sorry, you want me to read another one, or you want me to?
Yeah, would you read another poem?
Sure, absolutely. I was going to read the Ana Mendieta poem. It's called The President of Coca-Cola. Ana Mendieta is the president of Coca-Cola and dresses in yellow, a mother of millions, an international pop star rolling by the riverside, covered in spit and feathers. Ana Mendieta is the US Senator from Florida, the governor of New Hampshire, 4 feet 10 inches seared into wood, traced with blood formed from mud and grass and gunpowder. She leans on the bar counter, a mentirita in her hand. Ana Mendieta is the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, a prestigious professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Ana Mendieta is a shadow play of light in the cornfields of Iowa, a mound of earth outside Havana, cave drawings. She's the mayor of Wichita, the tender-hearted sibling of the late dictator, a glamorous fashion model, welfare recipient, emergency case in the emergency room, a soldier, dentist, and historian, the host of a daily talk show on Telemundo who gulps down a milky black cow every day before taking calls. Ana Mendieta is the intellectual author of Miami's resurgence, the evil genius behind the bombing of a plane that killed every member of the national fencing team and the man who ripped out his lover's guts when she moaned the name of another. Ana Mendieta is a power hitter, MVP and 6-time All-Star, celebrating at a gay B&B on Duval Street with a chocolate slam and a tray of cocaine. Ana Mendieta is the president of Coca-Cola and a double agent, She invented the sitcom, the telephone, birthed Amazon, came over with 14,000 kids and got deported with 2,021 others, mostly murderers. Ana Mendieta fears that if she weren't an artist, she'd be devoted to a life of crime. Ana Mendieta is subject and object. She's overwhelmed by feelings of being cast out of the womb, from the island, from exile. Ana Mendieta is the target of racism and a particularly fierce misogyny. She has a wicked cackle, a cruel flutter of her hands. She swallows a dark and dirty, an eye of the storm, a fucked up float. Ana Mendieta is the goddamn president of Cola Coca, and she's both gleeful and embarrassed by the millions she earns, but also keen on what all that money can do. She's on the outside looking in and so in with the in crowd. Ana Mendieta is alone. She pushes and presses her face against the glass until there's a tiny hairline fracture that snakes back and forth, and the glass separates so she can pop each piece with her fingers. Ana Mendieta is the youngest of all, the last to open her eyes when Earth was created. She's the feminine ideal, the masculine ideal, the non-binary ideal, and inspires lust and fruitfulness. She loves handheld mirrors, fans, and is constantly dipping her fingers in honey jars. Ana Mendieta loses interest quickly. She's a peacock, a sack of bones, a woman dozing on the roof of a deli, 33 stories down.
Te piden poemas en español. Do you feel like reading anything in Spanish?
Yeah, I can read something in Spanish.
Okay.
Let me crack open the Spanish part here. Something short. Here we go. This is called Reencuentro. Ahora la clave, siempre hay una clave. Ahora los tambores y la íntima oscuridad. Ahora le baile, le pausa. Ahora la historia sobre el carcelero que por piedad libera a le future dictadores. Ahora su amante y la tinta invisible. Ahora les informe desde el frente. Ahora la traición que convierte en mito. La bomba casera que no explota. El sacerdote que interviene a su pesar. Ahora el carnaval, grito de victoria inesperada. Y les enfermes y les heridas. El discurso triunfal ante la multitud. Ahora el horizonte, le mismo, como ayer, naranja en vez de azul. La maldita circunstancia, ahora les flotas. Bactris cubensis, pinus cubensis, higo estranguladore. Repetir, repetir, ad infinitum. Ahora la anciana en el precipicio. Ahora le bendite compromiso de ser última en pie. Ahora le juego de ajedrez por la tarde, arroz con leche, paseo por el jardín, las uñas de los pies que necesitan ser recortadas. Este no es historia. Página marcada y subrayada, la historia representada para la posteridad. Foto retocada con precisión. Eventos ordenados. Así es como fue y no fue, y fue de verdad. Repetir, repetir, ad infinitum. Ahora le claro. Ahora le huesos a lo largo del piso de la mar.
So thank you. We'll invite questions from the audience, but in the meantime, I imagine there may be some participants here tonight who don't know about Ana Mendieta, and thus might not understand the context of her malleability in this poem as well. But would you talk a little bit about Ana Mendieta, who she was, and her importance to you, and whatever else you want to tell us about her?
Yeah, no, Ana Mendieta was a very important visual installation performance artist in the 80s and 90s. And she was crucial because she really built a bridge to Cuba. She was one of the first people who went back, not to cocaine and do that thing, but to actually take in what was Cuba and to try to build bridges back. And she left a mark both here and there. Her influence is actually rather broad. and she was unfortunately, she died under terrible circumstances. She was married to the sculptor Carl Andre, who's sort of one of the giants of the minimalist movement in art. And he was tried for her murder. He was found not guilty. A lot of people think that was, BS. And so her work is, or her name, her figure has become almost mythic in some ways, especially among feminist artists. In this poem, I just cast her as sort of every Cuban. Every line actually in the poem refers to an actual Cuban. When I say the mayor of Wichita, I do mean there is a Cuban-American mayor of Wichita. When I, refer to the sibling of the dictator, Fidel did have a sister who lived in Miami for many years. The governor of New Hampshire Sununu is half Cuban. We're sort of everywhere and in sort of weird places. And it's funny because this poem, it was commissioned by the Pettis Museum in Miami. And the idea was that an artist would be paired with poets or with writers to produce something. And I was given a piece of hers to respond to. And I wrote this piece, and Anna's estate is handled by her cousin. And her cousin and I know each other, we get along fine. We're not like intimate friends, but we've known each other for years and years. And she rejected the poem. She was completely freaked out by it and said, no. And so I ended up responding to another poet. Then I just had this poem sort of dangling. I didn't know what to do with it. So I sent it off to LitHub and got it published there. And she was fine with it being there for some reason, but not fine with it being in this anthology of Cuban artists and writers, where Ana Mendieta becomes every Cuban, becomes every exile, becomes every person, good and bad.
And what do you think the objection was?
I think it was, I think, Anna's gotten cleaned up a lot in death. She wasn't an easy person. She was pretty tough and, foul-mouthed, drank a lot, harsh sometimes with words. And I think that as the myth grows, she's reaching sainthood or something. And the poem definitely doesn't cast her as that, I think in some ways also the poem, casts her, especially at the end, as the victim of violence, in a way that is important to the story, but at the same time, not something that the family really wants to put up front. So I don't know. Jacqueline never explained it to me, and I never asked her. She objected. That's fine. I moved along. Yeah.
Well, maybe a few more questions, but so, okay, like many of your readers, I knew you as a novelist before I knew you as a poet. And over the last few years, I've seen some of these poems in print in various places, and began to realize that you are quite a good poet as well. And that was really exciting. But your novels have been so important to me and to so many other people. So I maybe want to talk a little about genre and how poetry fits into your writing life. Like, do you see genre distinctions? Are writing poems different from writing novels? Or did you write this like as a book of poems, or were you writing this over a long period of time?
Good question. I've always written poetry, but I never really took poetry very seriously. I took it seriously to the extent that I am a serious fan of poetry. I read poetry every single day. I have a discipline about reading poetry every single day. And when I was teaching, it was something I would tell my prose students that they should do, that they needed to read poetry every day. They needed to to listen to language in this other way, this way that was about sound and about, rhythm and cadence and meaning all wrapped into one, that they needed to understand the economy of poetry, and the beauty of it too. So I am and I've always had tremendous respect for poets. And so what I was doing just didn't seem particularly disciplined or anything that was beyond me. What happened was that I had notebooks full of poems just from the time I was like in third grade. And a good friend of mine, Lawrence Schimmel, to whom this book is dedicated, actually. When I lived in Chicago, he would come visit every year. There was a sci-fi conference or something that he went to in Madison, Wisconsin, and he runs a little poetry press, Midsummer's Night's Dream, and every year we'd talk about poetry, and he'd get me to pull out another notebook, and he'd read these, poems, and every year he'd say, you should put something together. You have material to put something together. And I never got around to it, but he did. He collected a bunch of the notebooks, and he put together this chapbook, which he published as the title was This Is How It Is in Our Other Life. And it really made me sort of reconsider things and think about my relationship to poetry a little bit differently. Also, when I came out to the West Coast, I started as a project of my own to translate Juliana Spar, who is one of my colleagues at Mills College, who's an unbelievable poet. I mean, just absolutely stunning. And when you translate, you never read closer than when you translate. There is no closer reading than when you translate, because you're responsible for every one of those words. So it was a real, sort of a real education in reconsidering poetry. And I just very slowly started piecing things together. Plus, post-divorce, it was all I was writing. I was only writing poetry. So it seemed like the way to go. And mercifully, luckily, Beacon was interested. So here we are.
What are you writing now?
I'm back to writing a novel.
Yeah.
It's taking forever. The pandemic is killing me. But because my kids are home. But yeah, I'm writing a novel. I suspect that I'll write more poetry, but the next project is definitely this novel that I promised my agent like a year and a half ago, and I need to get through it. I want to write this thing. It's just, and I know the story, but I'm working full time, and solo parenting, so it's taking a little bit longer. Catherine Reese is asking what book of Juliana's I translated. And I did not translate a book by Juliana. I translated individual poems of Juliana's for my own edification.
And Ruben Quesada, hi Ruben, is asking if you have plans to write more short stories.
Yeah, actually, I have one going right now, simultaneous with the novel. Whenever I need a break from the novel, I shoot over to the short story and look at it for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I ask both in your novels and a bit in so in this book there are certainly poems about Jewishness in different forms, and in your novels there is a lot about Jewishness and the way in which it is has been hidden in Cuba. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it's like to write about that, and what it's like to sort of bring that hiddenness out into the open.
Well, for me, it was revelatory because I did so much research for Days of Awe, which was the first book that really hit a lot of that stuff. I knew some stories from my dad, but very limited, very blurry. And I just went crazy for like 2 or 3 years, really studying and researching and spending time in the synagogues and talking to people, and also at the National Library, and following all kinds of leads in different foundations, different documents to sort of piece something together. I'm always curious about like the hidden parts of us, the ways that we discover who we are, you know. Oh my God, I woke up a Jew. Oh my God, I woke up a lesbian. How this knowledge can completely kind of knock you out. In the last couple of years, the relationship with Jewishness has been a little bit different. My dad has passed, and so the need to connect with him, it became less urgent. But what became more urgent was what to do in terms of my children. And I worked when I was in college. I worked in a bakery that was run by a cult. The only reason I worked in this bakery is because the cult's bakery was incredibly successful, and they didn't have enough cult members to actually work in the bakery, so they were forced to hire out. And I remember talking to all these people who were in the cult and realizing that every single one of them seemed to come from families that had very little like religious training, or like they were desperate for some sort of spiritual something. So I realized I really want my kids to have something to rebel against, but I want them to have something to rebel against that I can live with, you know? So we actually became members of a synagogue this past year. First time I've ever been a member of any religious organization. I mean, I don't practice anything in a common fashion. And, you know, I still have a babalao in Miami. So it's a very sort of confusing thing. But yeah, I had my 9-year-old like going to Hebrew school. And to my surprise, I mean, I check all his, conversations on Fortnite, all his chats. And I'm always amused when my little blonde Viking-like boy identifies himself as Cuban and Jewish. So this is great. He'll rebel against that at some point. I don't know. I mean, it just felt like I needed to ground him in something. And Judaism has some really good stuff, like, the justice stuff. I mean, that kills me every time, The justice thing is very important. So that's where we're at.
Well, and you mentioned your Babalao in Miami, but I mean, again, and I know this isn't about ruins, but I'm wondering if this sort of filters into your writing more generally in a different way. But right, ruins, there is this bit about Judaism as it is also being practiced by, or as it is also not being practiced, but is also in the mix along with African religion, right?
Absolutely.
Or African religious practices, I'm wondering if that's, have you sort of continued to write and think about the ways these things intersect?
Sure. I mean, for me, the moment when I really realized the intersection was when I went to a babalao and he performed a cleansing. Mm-hmm. And the cleansing was essentially a Sephardic caparo ritual, mm-hmm. except that somebody was blowing tobacco smoke in my face the whole time. It was essentially the same thing, except the Jews do one thing with the the chicken afterwards, and the Cubans do another thing. The Jews eat it, of course. Nothing goes to waste, and the Cubans fail to take note of that and just let it rot. But I mean, there's lots of intersection with stuff, and I've often wondered, especially among the uneducated slaves and a lot of the early settlers, how that worked, how that managed to work. There was a tremendous uneven number of men and women in Havana and in Cuba for the first 50, 60 years of the conquest. The settlers were almost all men. And a lot of them were conversos who couldn't go back. So, it's not just African stuff, it's also indigenous stuff. The tobacco is not from Africa. The tobacco is indigenous to Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And so, all of that stuff is big, ajiaco is big stew. Nothing's authentic, nothing's pure. And I love that.
To summarize, we've discussed return and exile, language and gender, translation and self-translation, as genre, Judaism, African-based religions, indigenous religions, their intersections. Anything else you want to talk about before we part?
No, I think if anybody has a question, that's all. I mean, I'd be happy to entertain that, but otherwise, I feel.
Would you read one more poem?
Job, Daniel.
Oh,
did a great job.
Likewise. Would you read one more poem before we part?
Sure. I have. Well, let me see. What was I going to read? Yeah, got one. This is called Slow. The clock of the long now will operate knowing it will lose the correct time, exposed as it will be to imprecise temperatures, stellar and solar alignments, tectonic movements, orbital dynamics, and the fallacies of the human hands that must keep winding it by turning a crank or pulling a chain. In the German village of Halberstadt, at the end of the 20th century, a trust of theologians, composers, and musicians gathered to discuss the 649-year history of the organ, what Mozart called the king of instruments. 3 centuries earlier, in that same German village, a court Jew had defied the authorities by printing 2,000 copies of the 12-volume Babylonian Talmud as a gift to the poor. The Talmud, which runs almost 3,000 pages, can weigh about 30 pounds. That same court Jew had also built a synagogue, Baroque in style and said to be quite beautiful, that stood for more than 300 years until it was demolished in 1938 after Kristallnacht, and from which rose an aircraft factory a few years later, manned by slaves transported from nearby Buchenwald. In that same village, there's a church without a basilica, centuries old, bare and rugged and abandoned, a former monastery and pigsty constructed out of a harsh, cold stone. The theologians, composers, and musicians built an organ there that kicked off its only concert with a 17-month rest. Its first note came later, like an air raid siren, and played for months and months, heaving and exhaling, crackling and burning. Now, every few years, the villagers, descendants of the court Jew, of those who devastated the synagogue and worked in the factory and at Buchenwald, they come and rearrange the 30-pound sandbags that weigh down the organ's pedals. There's a whir and a note is added and the chord changes. Pipes are installed as needed. Each movement will last a lifetime. The clock of the long now will tick once a year. The century hand, which corresponds to the hour hand on a typical timepiece, will move every 100 years. Using the Daf Yomi cycle of a page a day, it takes more than 7 years to read the Talmud, though enlightenment is a different matter. On the planet Venus, a day lasts longer than a year. Here on Earth, blue whales come to the ocean's surface mostly at night, their hearts pumping a torpid 4 to 8 beats a minute. Their songs are composed of a handful of notes, but we usually hear only about half of them, the tones dropping into frequencies too low, too deep for us. I am telling you this because time is a ruined fountain, a prayer to the sea, a headfirst dive into stillness. I'm telling you this because the universe is at absolute zero until I rise naked to the surface, night or day, and you are there.
Wow.
Well,
I can't think of a better way to end this evening, but such a pleasure to have you both. Daniel, Achy, congratulations. Thank you to everybody in the audience tonight. Such a great crowd. And
Thank you. I'm delighted to see so many people here and see so many familiar names and faces. Peter, thank you so much for having us. Daniel, this was terrific. I look forward to your next book, although I really loved your last book. And I hope people will find it too after tonight. Thank you. Muchas gracias, everyone. Thank you so much.